Okay, hi everybody in 712. This is Alison Zuniga and Jessica Miller, and we are here to discuss our similarities and differences in the experience of our first attempt at coding for qualitative research. So I thought that maybe we'd get started just by kind of going over some big ideas in terms of how we approached coding. Not we can get in just a moment. We'll get to like the actual similarities and differences in our processes. But when you approach coding, Jesse, what did you notice about your process that you liked, maybe something that you would change?
Okay, great, Allison. First of all, this is the first time I've ever done coding. So it was kind of a learning process for me as I went through the process. I did do just the kind of mechanics of the coding this time. I did it using the computer, and I found that wasn't the best format for me. I think I'm more of a paper pencil kind of person. So for my interviews, when I actually do my research, I think I'm definitely going to have the hard copies and write on them and move things around. I think that will be more helpful for me. As far as the coding went, I felt like I was kind of saying the same thing over and over again as I kind of was moving through the articles. But I think that might have been a good thing because I might have been identifying some themes as I was going through the process. But as we're going to talk about in a little bit with our similarities and differences, I really liked how you went about using your focused coding. I added mine in with the text of the interview, which kind of made it hard for me to separate it out. But after I saw your interviews, I liked how you put yours at the bottom and it kind of wrapped everything up. So I think that's a technique that I will definitely use as I move forward. So how'd the process go for you?
Yeah, I had some similarities with the way that you approached it as well. I straight off the bat, I know that I'm more of a kinesthetic person, so I printed out everything first, and then I made my own notes on them, and I even had emailed you and said that I was gonna maybe just like scan all of them. Then I realized how long the interviews were and how messy my handwriting was. So after I liked going through it by hand. I liked first going. I did the coding line by line first, and I try to pick out anything after having read sort of a little bit about the context of the situation. And I started actually with Trudell's interview, and then I went Trudell, Eisenberg, and then Bennett. And I think that ended up like sort of influencing what I was able to see in the coding, which I know is like the comparing data to data, which is a part of the coding process. So I like that. But after I had written everything down and I had coded it line by line, I immediately did the focus coding. I went back through once through what I had coded line by line, and then I just chunked out like major concepts, like you said, that kept repeating themselves, and I just listed them like in bullet point. And then from there, I found it interesting how we approached the memos too, because we both did that a little bit differently. I didn't have any necessarily specific quotes that I looked at that I was making memos from. For me, it was just kind of like big picture ideas of what I got from, or what impression I got from that particular person in that interview. So then I had to move it all from paper to the document, the Word document, which took a little bit of time. But I really enjoyed actually the coding part. At first, I thought it was gonna be really overwhelming, but I liked it. It's even we were warned that we might like it, so I guess that's a good sign.
Right. You brought up about the context of the interviews. I really realized through this process how critical that is. We, yes, had information for this assignment, looking at videos and clips and reading articles, but I think it's going to be so critical when we do our own interviewing to know all of the context so intimately that I think it's going to help us with the coding even further. Because a lot of times I found myself while I was working through this process having to stop and think, okay, what was happening at that time, put it in the time frame, and kind of get my mind around that because it's not the current setting that I'm living in. So I think having the context of my classroom will definitely make the coding go more smoothly.
I completely agree. And to build on that, I think that's also why it'll be important to have the context so clear in our when we present our data and our research, because as an audience, like there's some people that don't know us, they don't know our context. And so in order to understand what we're doing, it's going to be important for us to really present that information clearly, so that like how we are the audience interpreting this information, when we have our own audience, it's going to be important for us to provide that thorough context as well. So let's go through some of the similarities and differences that we came through, or that we encountered in the articles. Do you have a preference for which article you want to start with?
No, feel free to
Mhm.
pick.
Okay.
Or I could go first. It's fine.
Okay.
I noticed on a lot of the interviews, I liked something that you did. When you were coding, you put a lot of explanation of the emotions or the kind of attitude that came across, like straightforward or sense of humor. And I didn't think to do that in my coding, which was one of our differences. But I think by adding that, your coding gave the rest of your codes more context. I wish I would have gone through then and added that piece, because adding that in there made it a little more human, the interviews, and could help me understand the things that were happening a little bit better. So that was a difference we had, but I definitely think it was a positive on your end.
Well, great. I appreciate that. Thank you. And I was kind of surprised, I guess, by like the how the emotions differed based on the person. I like I said, I started with Trudell, and I felt that this person was very emotional. They were coming from a very emotional place, whether that emotion was aggression or being strong-willed, or being so conscious of their own identity. Like for me, that's what really came across with the Trudell interview, was that this person, and we both noticed this in the beginning of the interview, we both had marked down that they like basically she had come into the desegregation fight by default. She was basically just looking for a cause. Like she was one of those like career activists, I guess you could say, who just
Right.
was looking for that particular, that like she liked. I felt she liked thriving as the underdog. I made reference to like the underdog, the David and Goliath a couple of times. Like she
Right.
enjoyed that role, and that was a really core part of her identity, which for me was the reason why she was willing to throw her kids under the bus and put them in that situation when they didn't want to be in that situation,
Right.
compared to Eisenberg, who came across to me complete opposite in terms of emotions. She to me was very neutral. She was very like even keeled. She didn't come across as letting her emotions dictate anything, other than I felt like she was like authentically concerned with the desegregation issue, and her whole family seemed to have the same common like moral ground, which to me again, like I guess stems from that idea of like how they feel as people and who they are as people, and that is going to affect their perspectives. And going back, like the research question is about, the whole research question is trying to answer the perceptions of the community about the desegregation, and we were listening to people that were involved in it, and to hear like how their perceptions were developed or what their perceptions were based on as the underdogs, was really interesting to me.
I found it interesting in the Eisenberg interview that I almost felt at the beginning that she was justifying why she was even involved in the desegregation movement. She was talking about how she was middle class, but then she had to add in there, but I grew up poor, so I knew about what it was like to feel like to be looked down upon or treated in a different way. And I almost felt like she was justifying her involvement in the entire issue. And then along with that, I guess, as we bring as researchers our own personal opinions and experiences into our coding, I looked at that article a lot as the mom in me. Like how could someone who didn't seem passionate about the issue, and she kind of just seemed to fall into it a little bit, put her children in that situation. So to me, she wasn't coming across as this strong person who had this strong belief, and she was going to do anything she could to kind of move it forward, but she was still putting her children into a situation that was definitely difficult. So I brought my own perspective as a mom into that, and as I was doing the coding, I was trying to like balance the okay, non-biased researcher as much as possible with the okay, I'm a mom, and you don't want to do that to your kids unless you really feel strongly about something. So
Yeah.
that was just something that I kind of keyed in on.
Yeah, that's really interesting. That's a good point. I don't have that perspective, not yet. So I don't, I didn't, I, for me, what I picked up on in terms of the mother role was again that Trudell was willing to just like sacrifice the kids. And I felt like Eisenberg was a bit more willing to like, she was concerned with her kids. I know that there was a threats of physical violence, and I think that speaks a lot to like the power structures being threatened in both of these articles. But I didn't, I felt like the kids were on board versus Trudell's kids, which were kind of like, why are we doing this? And so I thought that was kind of an interesting perspective from the kids' point of view who are actually experiencing desegregation.
I liked how you brought up the leadership, because I think that I found interesting in the, or I'm sorry, not leadership, violence. I thought that was interesting as well. How you said that for all of the conflict going on at that time, I was surprised that they didn't touch more on violence that would be happening. And I mean, it was brought up at a few different places, but they never went into a great amount of detail. And it was kind of mentioned but glossed over. So I'm wondering if that was done intentionally through the interviews, or as time went on, you try to distance yourself from unpleasant experiences. And I was wondering if that maybe tied in to their interviews. And that kind of tied in then with my memos that I used. I found myself using my memos a lot as questioning things that I had heard or read in the interviews. And obviously we didn't have the opportunity in this experience to go back and ask further questions or to lead to a follow-up question. But those memos were kind of, to me, the follow-up question of, okay, the person being interviewed said this, it made me think about this. What would be the follow-up question that I would have wanted to ask if I was there in the interview? And I think part of that is because I don't feel that I'm a strong interviewer giving the interview. So I'm trying to work on that. So that was one of the things that I used this activity for, this assignment is, okay, they say this, what would I say next? Now, of course, I had the benefit of time. I wasn't actually speaking to someone, so I could think about the questions that I would want to ask. But I definitely have to get better at asking those questions quickly as a follow-up so there's no lag in the interview. So I kind of focused on the interview process.
No, I think that's, and to add to that too, I think it's okay if you do take, like, so in the book it had said that you want to compare data with data, and so like you want to interview the same person on different occasions and like kind of see like how their answers measure out. And I think that going through this process, even if you don't think of the questions within that particular interview, you can reflect on that. And I think that's part of this process is like, once you do the interview, you transcribe it, you code it, and then you can develop those questions for like the next interview cycle, and they'll be all connected. So I think that is something that going into the interview, especially when we're early on in this experience and we're still novices, I think that we can go in with a plan, and then that's what's going to really enrich our qualitative data over time, is that reflective process in between interviews with those participants, I think.
I agree. And you brought up again the transcription. That's another area that I was thinking about as I was reading these interviews. That's going to be a large chunk of time for these interviews, especially, but also when we do our interviews. And I don't think I'd really thought about that in too much detail until I was actually coding and going through the articles and thinking about each line, how much time, and you want to make sure you have it right, how best to set up the interviews and the recording process so that when it's time to go back and to transcribe that information, that it's done correctly and done well.
Yeah. Absolutely. That's going to be interesting. As far as, I think we're at almost about a 15-minute mark here. So just to wrap up, we could talk about this all night, Jesse, but just to wrap up, some overarching themes that kind of stuck out to me that we kind of had maybe a little bit of differences on in terms of like what we focus on with these. I noticed that for me, a constant theme that came up was the power structures being threatened. I felt like the superintendent's desegregation plan was intentionally made to fail. It seemed like the community really needed like baby steps to get into the desegregation in terms of community perception. Like, I feel like overall there was just fear of change. Not necessarily that, I mean, there was obviously stagnant racism across the board, but I think that came from a sense of fear of the power structures being threatened. And one thing that really stuck out with me to demonstrate this was in Eisenberg's interview, when she mentioned at her synagogue, how the people that she was talking to were like anti integration. They weren't in favor of that. And to me, that was surprising. And I marked this down in my notes because what was surprising is you would think that the Jewish community would be more understanding of such crazy racism and segregation and unequal access based on what the Jewish community has been through not too long before this interview took place. So I think that when I saw that comment, to me, it reflected it really reinforced the fact that the power structures and the social structures were being threatened, and that's what people were fearful of in the community. The cops weren't coming when there was threats because they probably didn't like it. The Jewish community wasn't into it. And I think I actually drew it out on my when I did it by hand, I drew it out. But it was like, if this is the community, like this is the social structure, and you have like the white community, maybe like the Jewish community, and then the African American community, and then this brought it. It was going to bring it like this, and so that power structure, even I just felt like it was going to bring everything to a level playing field. And that's what the community was scared of, was losing any kind of social stature that they had gotten. They weren't willing to give it up. It's the same way that I feel like sometimes, if you look at American history, how immigrants, once immigrants have settled and they're a couple generations down, and then you get new waves of immigrants, there's that like resistance and that fear of their position as being threatened in society. And so to me, that was kind of like the overarching theme that I got from these interviews. Even it had mentioned the Black elite, the African American elite, were kind of giving up on this because they realized that they were going to lose their jobs as principals somehow. Like it wasn't going to work out. So they don't want to lose their position in society. And so to me, that's when it comes to the question of what were the perceptions of the community. How could we look at these interviews and get an idea of what the perceptions of the community were about desegregation? To me, that's what stuck out, was the fear of the power structures being threatened.
Great point. I thought of it as the community perceptions of the leadership of people that were in charge of this movement. And in all three of the interviews, you kind of saw a different perspective of different people who were leading the movement. Some of them were very positive comments about like, she's a great leader and she had everybody behind her. Or there were other ones like, I don't know how he got into the place that he was. So it was kind of interesting to see how the three different interviews looked at the leaders in a different way. So I just found that part interesting as well. So I think we had a good conversation. Hopefully we covered everything we needed to, and I hope everybody enjoys seeing it.
Yeah, thank you, Jesse. Thank you for meeting. I know it's late for you.
That's okay. Have a good evening.
Thanks, you too. Bye.
Bye.